Amen. Good evening, everybody. Thanks for that. I thought that was great, by the way. Really just got close to God in the time of singing together. Tonight we are beginning our new series through the book of Daniel, and going to be handling a couple of topics as we look at the book of Daniel. But let's read together from chapter 1, and speaks about what happened in Daniel's life. He'd been living in Jerusalem. Jerusalem is conquered by Nebuchadnezzar, and he ends up being forcibly removed and ends up living in a place called Babylon. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem, and he besieged it. And the Lord delivered Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his hand, along with some of the articles from the temple of God. These he carried off to the temple of his God in Babylonia and put in the treasures of the house of his God. Then the king ordered Ashpenaz, chief of his court officials, to bring in some of the Israelites from the royal family and from the nobility, young men who were without any physical defect, handsome, showing aptitude for every kind of learning, well-informed, quick to understand, and qualified to serve in the king's palace. And so what the king was planning to do is take the best from Jerusalem, the best from Israel, train them up, and make them work in the courts of the king and be to his benefit. The king assigned them a daily amount of food and wine from the king's table. They were to be trained for 3 years, and after that, they were to enter the king's service. Among these were some from Judah, 4 men that are named Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And the chief official gave them new names, and to Daniel, the name of Belteshazzar. To Hananiah, he gave the name Shadrach. To Mishael, Meshach, and to Azariah, Abednego. But Daniel resolved not to defile himself for the royal food and wine, and he asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. Now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. But the official told Daniel, "I'm afraid of my lord the king, who has assigned your food and drink. Why should he see you looking worse than the other young men of your age? The king would then have my head because of you." Daniel then said to the guard whom the chief official had appointed over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, "Please test your servants for 10 days. Give us nothing but vegetables to eat and water to drink." This is not where the whole vegetarian thing started. This is a religious decision he's making, just so we can clarify that, because people go on the Daniel diets and all kinds of things like that. And I guess it will make you healthy if you eat lots of veggies. But for somebody like me, a good piece of meat is also great. Verse 13, "Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see." And so he agreed to this, and he tested them for 10 days. At the end of 10 days, they looked healthier and better nourished than any of the younger men who ate the royal food. And so the guard took away their choice food and the wine that they were to drink, and he gave them vegetables instead. That's for 3 years they lived on vegetables. To these 4 young men, you must know that's a calling of God when you do that. To these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. And Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. At the end of the time set by the king to bring them in, the chief official presented them to Nebuchadnezzar. The king talked with him, and he found none equal to Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And so they entered the king's service. In every matter of wisdom and understanding about which the king questioned them, he found them 10 times better than all the magicians and enchanters in his whole kingdom. And Daniel remained there until the 1st year of King Cyrus. Now, as I said, we are starting with a series entitled Daniel, and we're going to be looking at different themes through the book of Daniel. The one that I'm going to be dealing with tonight is called Taken. You can see it over there on the board. I think it's also on the PowerPoint behind me. And this involves Daniel's decision, who's forcibly removed from Jerusalem, forced to live in Babylon. It's about his decision to live a godly life in a very pagan culture. We're going to be talking about the choices that Daniel makes. And some of the choices that Daniel makes for the sake of God are costly choices. And you remember some of the things that happened to Daniel. We're going to look at the whole thing of the sovereignty of God in politics. Is God really in control when it comes to politics? The way some people carry on, I wonder if they think that he is. Prayer. Prayer played an incredibly important role in Daniel's life. And we're going to look at some of the things that God said to him and showed him during the time of prayer, and how they were such an encouragement to the people of God during the years of exile. Empowered. How God gave to Daniel a very unusual gift, the gift of being able to interpret dreams. And the way that God used that to reveal himself even to people in authority in Babylon. And then lastly, steadfast faith. And Daniel's faith is not something accidental. It's something intentional. The reason he lives for God is because he made a decision to do that. Now, when we come to Daniel chapter 1, we discover that here in chapter 1, we have Daniel modeling what it means when a person who chooses to please God, when there are outside pressures and temptations that are trying to shape and conform their lives to the culture in which they find themselves. It's the pressure that some people feel when they're with their friends at school. It's that pressure to fit in with everybody because every one of us wants to be liked. It's that kind of pressure. It's the pressure that people feel, the temptation they feel when they leave their home and their church and they go to varsity for the first time and they start mixing with this huge crowd and things are happening. And we all know how many people have caved in when they've gone to varsity, been strong in their faith while they were at home and when they were at school and in their church. But come varsity, everything seems to change and they drift away from the Lord. It's the temptation to do what others around us do because it's cool and because it's the done thing. And so we feel that pressure and that temptation. Or it's even the pressure to throw in the towel when it really becomes tough to live out your faith for God. And so this evening I want to look at what it's like when Christians decide to put their faith into practice in a pagan culture. What is it like when Christians, people like you and I, we decide to put our faith into practice in a pagan culture? Because surely that's the challenge that faces all of us living in South Africa. I want to say to you, just for the record, there's no such thing as a Christian country. People talk about Christian countries. You'll find Christians in every country, every culture throughout the world. There's no one nation we can say this is a Christian nation. We can say there are a lot of believers in that nation, but we can't call a nation a Christian nation. The only nation that was the nation of God was the nation of Israel, which God selectively chose to follow him and to represent him. In Daniel chapter 1, the underlying message that Daniel wants to bring to us is that God is active in the lives of his people, even when they're unaware of it. God is active in the lives of his people even when they're unaware of it. And what happens with Daniel? Daniel writes the book of Daniel himself. And he's looking back over the years of his life. And you know, hindsight is always perfect sight. So as he looks back over the years of his life, he sees the way in which God has been active in his life. And what he does, in a sense for us, he pulls away the curtains. And he says, I want to show you what God was doing in the events of my life. And we begin to see something of what happened in the life of Daniel. Imagine living in a city like Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a conservative place. Even though the people were backslidden, people honored God. You could still worship God. There was freedom to worship God. And then he ends up in a city like Babylon, where people are hostile towards your faith. People don't care about what you believe anymore. And that's what happens to Daniel. He finds himself in a place like Babylon. And you will remember, for those of you who've read through the book of Revelation, that Babylon speaks about evil. It's the city of evil. It's where everything that is against God and anti-God is represented by Babylon. This happened to me. I remember before I went into full-time ministry, when I was working for a small company, and just a relatively small business, just 3 shops. I was training to be a clothing buyer, and got the offer to go and work for one of the chain stores in South Africa and to continue my training over there, and then eventually move into a buying position over there. And I thought, this is wonderful, prayed about it. God's leading me to go and do this. It's going to be a great time as for me as a young guy. And I remember after my first week over there, I thought I was living in Babylon. I couldn't believe some of the things people were doing. I couldn't believe the way they conducted themselves. I couldn't believe the underhanded business that was taking place over there. And I was expected to be part of that. And I want to say to you, I was way out of my depths. I didn't have a clue how to live out my faith in a place like that. Oh yes, I could do it in my hometown. I could do it in the little business in which I found myself. But the moment I was exposed to what was happening at this level, I was totally out of my depths. That's what happens to Daniel. Wonder how many of you realize that Daniel was only about 15 or 16 years old when he's taken to Babylon. How many of you are 15, 16 years old? Just stick up your hand for a minute. Okay? That's about how old he was. Being forcibly removed from Jerusalem and having to live in a place like Babylon. And what Daniel does for us and what he wants us to be aware of tonight, he wants us to see the way in which God is at work behind the scenes in our lives. The reason he does that is that many of us tend to understand what God is doing by the things that are going on in our lives. And very often what God is doing is hidden from us. It's unseen. We don't realize this. So Daniel takes us behind the scenes so the actions of God become obvious to us. Look at Daniel chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. We discover that Nebuchadnezzar, this powerful king from Babylon, he sends his forces and they overcome and they conquer King Jehoiakim, who's reigning in Jerusalem at that stage. And it would seem at face value, here's a powerful man with a better army, greater army, stronger army that's conquered the city of God and the people of God, and they're taken into captivity. But the Bible says that God gave them over. This wasn't about a powerful king defeating God's people. This was God's judgment over his people for all the years that they'd lived and abandoned their walk with God and backslidden and turned away from God. And so God comes and he sent prophet after prophet after prophet to go and speak to the people. And people don't listen. It's like people who hear sermon after sermon after sermon, but it makes no difference. That's what's happened to the people of God. And God says now, because of your hard-heartedness, you're going to go into slavery and into exile. The people that came out of Egypt, the people who are set free miraculously by the work of God, now end up back in slavery, back in bondage because of their sinfulness. And so Daniel said, this is the work of the Lord that's happening. You know what's so interesting for me over here? Daniel was a godly young man. But because of the sin of other people, he ended up facing the consequences of what they've done. I find that often happens to people. Sometimes we may not be the problem, but other people have done things. And we end up facing the consequences. We face the music. We get caught up in what they've done. And we get hurt because of what other people do. In Daniel chapter 1 and verse 9, as Daniel finds himself in Babylon, the Bible says, now God had caused the official to show favor and sympathy to Daniel. Here's a guy, he doesn't even know him. He's not a Christian. He's not a person who worships God, the God of the Bible. Here is a Babylonian man. But God, in an amazing way, brings this man across Daniel's path, and he finds favor with this man. Here's God's help to Daniel in a strange land. In verse 17, it says, to these 4 young men, God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning. The way in which Daniel was blessed by God was academically, as he studied the Babylonian language, he learned their literature, he learned about their culture, he learned about their history, and God blessed him in that. And then God gave to him a supernatural ability, and that was to be able to interpret dreams. And it's an amazing thing that when we choose to live for God, God's got his hand on our lives and God begins to bless us. It might not be in the academic field, but there are other ways in which God blesses our lives and his hand is upon our lives, and it's meant to be there for his glory. That's what God is doing in this situation. Let me show you some of the other places where God is at work in people's lives. And it seemed as though God was absent. It seemed as though God had removed his hand. It seemed as though there was no evidence of God being at work. There's a young man by the name of Joseph in Genesis. And he's a young guy, and he gets this prophetic word from the Lord, and he goes and tells his parents, young guy, goes and says to his mom and dad, you know what? One day, you and mom are going to bow down before me as well as all my brothers. Well, I mean, they must have thought that he, gone to bed too late or something like that. And he shares with them this word of prophecy, and it says they sort of kept this in their hearts. Obviously, something that they needed to think about. He goes and tells his brothers, and they get mad at him. It's like happened to some of you. Go and talk about the Lord and what God is doing and the way God is speaking in your life, and you just get this hostile response from people around you. His brothers went a step further. They said, it's time to get rid of this guy. He's a pain in our flesh, thorn in our side. And you remember they sell him into slavery. And here's the man with a word from the Lord. Here's a man whom God is going to use. Here's a man that God has spoken to. Here's a man who's carrying a prophecy from God. He ends up in Potiphar's household. God starts to bless what he's doing. Things are really going well over there. What happens? Suddenly Potiphar's wife comes in the scene, starts hitting on him over and over again. You heard about that whole thing of what happens when a woman is scorned. Well, it happened. And she lied about him, and he ended up in prison after being faithful to God. And then he gets into prison, and he's put into a position of authority in the prison, and he's trusting God. And he meets two people from Pharaoh's court. And they are released, and he says, guys, when you get back there, please don't forget about me. I'm sitting over here in prison. Have a word in the king's ear. And they forget about him for 2 years. And then eventually one day Pharaoh has a dream. And suddenly the guy that had been in prison, he said, hey, I know a guy that could interpret dreams. In fact, he interpreted my dream. And he gets called into palace. And when he comes face to face with his brothers one day, he says, you intended to harm me, but God intended for good, for the saving of many lives. And behind the scenes, in everything that was happening in Daniel's life, the hand of God was there. Guys, I want to say to you, sometimes you're walking in difficult places. Sometimes it doesn't make sense. But if you believe in God and you know Jesus, I want to say to you, the hand of God is at work. Look at Esther. Esther's a young woman. If you want to call it, she gets into an arranged marriage with the last person on earth she would want to marry. That was a guy by the name of Xerxes. He was a Persian king. She was a Jewess. You didn't marry into those circles. And she hides the truth of who she really is. And then the plot comes out. There's a man who is wanting to destroy the whole nation of the Jews. And so uncle comes to her and said, come on, man. Go and have a chat to your husband. Get some help from us. You're in hard places over there. And she said, you know what? I'm not even allowed into his presence unless he extends his scepter. In other words, you don't just walk into his, into his bedroom and say, hey, my mate, can you help us? We've got a slight problem over here. It doesn't work like that there. And she's fearful. She says, in essence, what's a person like me ever going to be able to do? And then those incredible words, you remember them, where Mordecai says to her, who knows that you're in a royal position for a time such as this? And she begins to believe that the hand of God's on her life. And we see that whole thing turns around because somebody starts to believe the hand of God's on their life, even in a situation like that. And of course, we see the same thing that happens with Daniel. And we see how God blesses him in verse 17. God gave knowledge and understanding of all kinds of literature and learning, and Daniel could understand visions and dreams of all kinds. If you want to go further than that, you can see God's activity among the nations. You look among the nations and you see people fighting and the wars and the things that are going on over there. What hope is there? Well, the psalmist says that the kings of the earth take their stand together against the Lord and against his anointed one. Let us break their chains, they say, and throw off their fetters. The one enthroned in heaven just laughs, and the Lord scoffs at them. In Acts chapter 4, we see the church facing its very first persecution. And they come away and they pray and they say, Sovereign Lord, you're in charge here. You're in control over here. In verse 27, indeed, Herod and Pontius Pilate met together with the Gentiles and the people of Israel in the city to conspire against your holy servant Jesus, whom you anointed. And they did what your power and will had decided beforehand should happen. There's something that I think there that stands out so powerfully for me and for you tonight. That one day when you look back in your life, you too will see the hand of God. If you will trust him. God's been at work behind the scenes when you didn't know and when you couldn't see and when you didn't understand. That the hand of the Lord has been upon your life and God has been active in your life. Now, I don't know who you're facing or who it is that might be a challenge in your life or what God has called you to do. The most important thing for you to realize tonight, God is quietly in control of all things in what is going on in your life. And it's because Daniel understands this, because Daniel believes that God is in control, because Daniel knows that God rules and reigns, that he makes a choice to live a godly life even when there are pressures and temptations all around him. I was living for God in a pagan culture, because in many senses that's what we are, is a decision that you and I have to make. It's a decision we make to please God. See, what people really believe about God will determine the way that they're going to behave. What you really believe. Not what we say we believe, not what we think we believe, but what we really believe deep down in our hearts influences our behavior and the choices we make and the decisions that we make. And Daniel's decision to live in a way that pleases God is something intentional. He said when he arrived there, he says to himself, I'm going to honor God. I'm going to live for God in this situation. I think one of the most important things that we need to be able to say to ourselves wherever we are living out our faith, I choose to live for God. It's a choice we make. Daniel resolved in himself, in his heart, not to defile himself with the royal food and wine. He asked the chief official for permission not to defile himself in this way. He resolved not to get involved in the Babylonian lifestyle more than was necessary. Guys, I need to just say this tonight. When we choose to practice our faith, it doesn't mean we disengage from our culture and our society. It means we are just very careful of how much we get sucked into it. We need to study. We need to work. We need to get involved. Daniel did all of those things. He doesn't cut himself off. He's involved over there, but he's cautious. He makes a decision that I'm going to choose what I do and make sure that I don't defile myself in what I do. I think the first way to stand firm in a pagan culture is to become aware of the pressures and the temptations that we're likely to face, and then we resolve to live in a way that pleases God. In other words, if we live in a culture where there are pressures to compromise in our morals, what we need to say is, I choose to please God with my morals. Now, can I just emphasize that for a moment? Not I choose to stay pure. I choose to honor God in what I'm doing. There's a big difference. It's not about me. It's the way that I choose to honor God. if we're living in a very materialistic culture and society where we can easily get caught up into money and success and all of these things, I choose tonight to honor God. I will not allow my culture to defile me. It's a choice I make. I understand the pressures. I understand where I'm living and the place in which I'm living. I choose to live for God. That's what Daniel said. A good example of this is when Joseph is tempted by Potiphar's wife day after day after day. And his response to her is, how could I do such a wicked thing and sin against God? Practicing your faith in your culture is all about pleasing God, not just about the things you don't do. Daniel didn't want to defile himself. Joseph didn't want to defile himself. Peter puts it like this in the New Testament. He says, live such good lives among the pagans, that though they accuse you of doing wrong, they may see your good deeds and glorify God on the day that He visits us. Choosing, making a choice, being intentional. The second thing I want you to see that Daniel does is his decision not to defile himself is done with wisdom and courtesy. I think sometimes the way we try and live our Christian faith gives God a bad name and Christianity a bad name. Daniel does this with incredible wisdom and with incredible courtesy. Daniel then said to the guard, please test your servants for 10 days. He's not arrogant. Not saying like my God is more powerful than you. Please just test your servants for 10 days. And even in a pagan culture, our actions need to be full of wisdom and pleasing to God. Remember the words of Jesus to His disciples. I'm sending you out like sheep among wolves, therefore be as shrewd as snakes and as innocent as doves. That's the choice that we need to make. And then lastly, Daniel expects God's help. He expects God's help. He says, test us for 10 days. I'm going to put it into practice. And I want to trust God that God's going to help us and God's going to see us through and God's going to be with us. Then compare our appearance with that of the young men who eat at the royal food, and treat your servants in accordance with what you see. I think one of the challenges facing all of us at the moment is, what do we choose to live for? And who do we believe? Because sometimes it's not easy, sometimes it's a challenge, sometimes it's difficult. But I want to say for all of us here this evening, it starts when we say, I know who reigns. I know who reigns. I know where all power sits. It sits with God. God is sovereign. God reigns and God rules. Guys, power is not with Nebuchadnezzar. That's the point. And power is not with somebody like Herod, even though he killed all the babies in Jerusalem under the age of 2 years old. And power does not sit with somebody like Pilate or Barack Obama or Jacob Zuma or any political system. God holds all the power in His hands. The God of the Bible that we believe in. He holds all authority, all power. And then Daniel resolves. He said, because I know, because I trust, and because I believe, and because I've got faith. That song we were singing just before we came to God's Word. Because of that, make a decision. I'm going to live for God. I'm going to be courteous and wise in the way that I do it. And I'm going to trust God, that God's going to come through for me. God's going to come through for me when I choose to live like that. So let's pray together. Just flowing out of the message tonight, the sense that I have in my heart is God wanting us to take that step of faith and say, Lord, I choose to live for you. It's a choice I make. It's a choice I make to honor you and to live for you in our society, in our community. I believe, Lord, that you reign and rule. I believe you've got your hand on my life tonight. I believe nothing is beyond your control. And I say that to you because something might be suggesting to you that he's not. And that it's not going to work out. And God has kind of stepped back and he's left you on your own. There's a wonderful thing that happens. It says in Hebrews chapter 11 verse 6, he rewards those who earnestly seek after him. Those who come to God must believe that he exists and that he rewards those who earnestly seek after him. I'm not sure what may be the challenge that you're facing. What might be what God is speaking to you about tonight. I want to say to you, God's hand is upon you. God is at work behind the scenes quietly. Even though you're not aware of that, God is at work. As we sing the next song, and it speaks about us being a people of faith, God reigns over all the earth, and I will sing it. That's what we were declaring. I think we must sing that song, over all the earth he reigns, that one we sing, God reigns. I sense that's the song we should sing now, and let's see how the Lord leads us and takes us from